All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to bring up and introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Pat Hall. Pat Hall is the owner of the 1026 Beckley Address, where Lee Harvey Oswald stayed just prior to the assassination. And she's going to be talking on Lee Oswald, the man I knew, because she knew Lee back when she was a little girl. Her grandmother owned the rooming house back then. So if you would, please give a warm welcome to Pat Hall.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it very much, and I appreciate Judith inviting me to come and speak with you today. I knew Mr. Lee. My brothers and I would go to my grandmother's house every day after school. It was your typical get the homework done and wait till Mama picks you up. And so that's why we knew Mr. Lee and the majority of the other 17 roomers. Yes, in '63, my grandmother rented out 18 bedrooms. The house does not look like it. It's very deceiving. But the main floor had 7 bedrooms, 1 bath. She rented out 5 of those bedrooms. This house is unique to Texas in that we have a full basement. Any of you from Texas? No, Texas doesn't do basements. But we ended up with a basement, so there's 5 bedrooms and a bath down in the basement. Then in '52, she decided that the backyard was a complete waste of space. So she built a 2-story back house with a garage and a washroom on either end. And there's 8 bedrooms back there. 4 up, 4 down, and a bathroom for each level. That's how she got her 18 bedrooms. So, we knew Mr. Lee as a soft-spoken, quiet, gentle young man that was courteous and polite and that loved children. Anytime he was there with myself and my brothers, he would stop whatever he was doing, go outside and play ball, tag, jump rope. Whatever my brothers were into, he was totally into it. He was more closed off when it came to adults. It was not his personality to come home and see other men in the living room and say, "Hi fellas, how was your day?" That was not him. He would come in, nod, acknowledging that he did see them. And if they spoke to him, he would respond in kind. But it was going to be a real short conversation. But with the kids, he was just totally there. And that's the way the children in Irving knew him. He would go see his wife, Marina, and the children every weekend. And he would take little June and Ruth Payne's children, 4 and 6, out in the front yard to play. And the neighbor kids would swarm. They loved him. And he would play 2-3 hours at a time with these kids. That's not what a 24-year-old does. A 24-year-old that even has his own kids plays maybe 30 minutes if the kids are lucky, but not him. And so the perspective of that the government puts out that he was this antisocial loner type personality is not what we knew. And I'm not here to convince anyone whether or not it was a lone gunman or whether it was a conspiracy. That's not my job. My job is to put a human face on the man that I knew. This is the house that when my grandmother bought the house in 1940. She bought it as a widow, and she moved in with a young teenager, my mother. My mother's brother was already pretty much out on his own. This is what the house looked like in 2013 when I opened up as a museum. My darling grandmother, Gladys Amy Arant Johnson. A.C. Johnson was a second marriage to my grandmother, and even though she is actually smiling in this picture, the next picture you're going to see is what we mostly got. She ruled the house with an iron fist. She only had 3 rules that would get someone kicked out of the house, and that was drinking, a weapon, or someone in your room. No one was allowed to have anyone in their room whatsoever. If you got caught, she would pack your things herself, put them by the door, and when you got home that night, you were informed, you no longer live here. If she was informed, well, I can't find a place this time of night, she'd say, well, you can leave your things here overnight, and there's a park right behind us. I'm telling you, she was a tough bird. This is what my brothers and I looked like in '63. I was 11, Hal was 10, and Mike was 6. As you all know, the shots rang out at 12:30 and killed our darling, sweet man president, John F. Kennedy. My grandmother was at her cafe that she still owned and ran at that time. And that's where she and my grandfather were that particular day. Earlene Roberts was the housekeeper. She was partly blind in one eye, and she wore very, very thick glasses. And it was her normal routine to sit down every day at 12:30 to watch As the World Turns. And on that fateful day, Walter Cronkite comes on the air and announces about 12:40-ish, 12:45, that our president had been shot. Well, actually what he announced was shots has been fired in Dallas at the president. Please stand by, and they went back to the show. And so naturally, Earlene was watching with bated breath. When the president was shot, there was a motorcycle officer on the presidential side of the limousine behind. He immediately drops his motorcycle and runs into the book depository and hollers, "How do I get to the roof?" The manager goes and tries to get the elevator, the big elevator, this freight elevator. Thank you. I just went blank on that freight elevator to come down. They later discovered that it's stuck on the 3rd floor. He does call up, "Somebody lock those gates." No one does, so they take the stairs. Naturally, the officer goes into the break room because he noticed some movement going on and confronts Mr. Oswald. The manager comes behind him and says, He's good. He works here. So off they went. After that, Mr. Lee leaves the book depository. This is their first little bitty red flag. But he does some quirky things on his way to our house. He goes off on Elm about 3 blocks and gets on the bus. I've never understood why he got on the bus, because he knew Elm and Houston were blocked off. Traffic wasn't going anywhere. And now that shots had been fired, it most certainly wasn't going anywhere. But he does get on the bus, and then he gets off again because it's not moving. He goes over to the Greyhound bus station. He starts to get in a cab, and a little pregnant lady comes up behind him and asks the cab driver how soon another cab would be by. He gives her that cab and waits on the second cab. He starts to get into that cab, and a little older lady comes up and asks the same question. He offers her that cab. She thanks him for it and says she's not quite ready to leave. These are not the actions of somebody that just shot the president and is trying to get the Sam Hill out of the area. He comes back to the house and comes in about 12:50 to 12:55. And this is the way I remember Mr. Lee. We did not know him as Lee Harvey Oswald. We knew him as O.H. Lee. What happened to this sweet, happy little boy? He had a miserable childhood. And I think this is where, and if you're a researcher, I'm sorry, but I think investigators and researchers have dropped the ball. They dropped the ball immediately after the president was shot. Because I think that finding out the why he would be involved is the crux. His mother, Marguerite, was definitely eccentric. I believe she was probably undiagnosed bipolar because she moved the family constantly. Lee never went to the same school 2 years in a row. Sometimes he'd go to 2 schools in a year. That's very disruptive for a child. And all the experts agree that he was dyslexic. They didn't know what dyslexia was in those days. And even if he got a teacher that recognized a learning disability, there was not going to be any consistency in help for him. By the time he's 15, he quit school. And this is where, and I will admit, this is my theory. It's my thoughts, because it struck me in my heart and in my gut. He gets a little job, and he joins a group called the Air Civil Patrol. And it's run by David Ferry. We know that David Ferry was ex-military. He had high military connections. He was a CIA operative. He was involved with the mob. He was a pilot and was known to fly hitmen from one city to another. He was gay, and it was rumored, but not proven to my knowledge, that he was a pedophile. I believe he was. I believe he saw this vulnerable, sweet, unfocused, unhappy 15-year-old and took advantage. He manipulated this young man for 2 years because he joins the Marines when he's 17 years old. And the one thing he was teased about in boot camp was that he was such a lousy shot. Our darling government says that he was a sharpshooter. But when you look at his military record, it shows that his scores in boot camp were marksman to low marksman, and one day in boot camp, he had a good day of shooting and got the score of a low sharpshooter. That's not a sharpshooter. So he did not have the expertise to do what he is accused of. He eventually goes to Moscow. He meets Marina. Within 10 weeks, they're married. Within 10 months, she gives birth to little June. His journey in the military is also very, very questionable. In the military, they usually only send you to a training school one school at a time, one subject at a time, because they want your focus on the material that they are teaching. But because he was so brilliant and had learned to compensate for his learning disability, they sent him to 2 schools at the same time. Radar, which is very technical, mathematical, with geometry thrown in there, and the other, the Russian language school, the hardest language in the world to learn. And he aced them. He sent then to Japan. Okay, I'm going to have to hurry. He sent to Japan, suddenly asked for a hardship discharge. Normally takes 30 to 90 days to get that. He got his in less than 15 days. Don't sit there or stand there and tell me that there wasn't somebody pulling strings. And when he and Marina were ready to come back to America, that was during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was not in the habit of opening their front door and saying, "Have a wonderful life in America." But Marina had no problem getting out of the Soviet Union. Somebody was pulling strings. Unfortunately, Officer J.D. Tippit lost his life that day. The circumstances around that death are ongoing. Why? Who really shot J.D. Tippit? I'm still on the fence. The FBI and the police only wanted to use white witnesses. They ended up having to use Domingos Benavides because he was the only one that was able to identify Lee in a lineup. Everybody else couldn't do it. Aquila Clemens told her family that that night, men identifying themselves as FBI came to her house and suggested to her that it would just be best for her and her family if she didn't get involved. Her family moved her out of that house very quickly. Lee is finally captured at the Texas Theater. My mother was an artist and photographer, and guess what? Her photography studio just happened to be across the street from the Texas Theater. So she saw Lee being arrested. She was already upset about the president, and now her mother had a rumor being arrested. The day was not getting any better. She shut down, came to the school where my brothers and I were. Just seconds after the principal came on the air and told us that we had lost the president, my mother shows up. She takes us to our family home. She unplugs the TVs and says, "They're broke." Hal and I look at her and go, "Mama, we just saw you unplug the TVs." And she got on what we used to call her forklift. She pulled her shoulders back, straightened her back, and went, "I said they're broke." And we looked at each other and went, "Okay, Mama's gone nuts. Let's get out of here." She didn't allow us to watch TV at all that weekend until Sunday morning. Yes, we're watching Daybreak in with the transfer of Lee from city to county jail. They bring him out. Jack Ruby steps forward and shoots him. My brothers, who loved Lee so much that they were both hollering, "That's Mr. Lee! That's Mr. Lee!" She jumps up, turns off the TV. I'm surprised she ever turned it back on. And she has to sit down with us and explain to us why, what has been going on, what he was accused of, and why we just saw our friend shot on live TV. Is there a real connection between Oswald and Ruby? In the picture at the bottom, you will see a picture of a man in the carousel. They say this is Lee. I am sorry. That's a fairly decent look-alike, but he's aged at least 10 to 15 years more than Lee. So that is not Lee in the carousel. Another question for me is, why was the parade route chosen? In our form of government, the Secret Service is the only entity that can override the president's wishes when it comes to his safety. They wanted the parade route to come straight down Elm. No turns, no slowdowns, straight to the highway. Why did the Secret Service allow LBJ to change the parade route? Granted, Main Street was the normal, traditional parade street. But why would they override their own wishes for the safety of our president and listen to LBJ? That's a major problem for me. So who was behind the assassination? My personal choice, the head of the snake, is LBJ. Was Malcolm Wallace up there on the 6th floor? I don't know. I've been told that there is a fingerprint that belongs to him, so he could be there. Was this a rogue CIA group involved? I believe most likely they were. Was the mob also involved? I believe they were. And how many others? I have no idea. November 25th was such a sad day for our country, our world, our state, and our city. John F. Kennedy, J.D. Tippit, and Oswald were all buried on the same day. Our president and J.D. Tippit got a rousing send-off. Oswald, the funeral home could not, it took them 24 hours to find a minister that was willing to say a prayer over his grave. I think that is such a shame, because the minister is there for the living, not the dead. This is a shame. And yet, they had to turn to reporters that were there for the story to be pallbearers, because there was no one else. His funeral was attended by his mother, Marina, his 2 children, and his brother Robert. That was it, other than the reporters. So here's my home. Please come. I have so many more stories that I can tell, but I will tell you one story, and I know many of you have probably already heard this story either from YouTube or from other people. But one of the moments of compassion that I saw Mr. Lee show, about 2 weeks before the assassination, my brothers, Hal and Mike, were in the front yard wrestling. Not a smart idea between a 10 and a 6, but that was boys, and they were always wrestling. Mike gets hurt. But Mike has a short fuse. He doesn't sit there and cry. He jumps up and pops Hal really hard. They start fighting. I'm in the house. Before I can get out there and stop the fight, Mr. Lee, who was just sitting on the front porch, watching it all go down, gets up, goes out, separates them, and puts them on those stairs out there. And he sits in between them. And he says, "Boys, I want to tell you something, and it's really important, so listen to me. You're brothers. You got to care for each other. You got to love each other and never do anything that would harm another human being." That is not the remarks of a 24-year-old to 2 little boys that he's only known for less than 6 weeks. This man that I knew was a compassionate man. He loved children. He was sweet to me always, absolutely always. And when he would see me struggling with my homework, or my grandmother pounding the next day test questions into my head, he would always try to get close to me and say, in a very low voice, because no one wanted my grandmother's wrath, "Do not worry about this. Just do your best, but don't ever give up." He expected me to overcome my learning disability of dyslexia as well. I still struggle with mine, but he conquered his. He read 4 newspapers every day, cover to cover. My grandmother kept the Dallas papers, the Fort Worth paper, and a New York paper in the living room at all times. And he read every one of them, cover to cover, every day. So don't tell me this was not a brilliant man. A man that had a lot more going on inside him. He needed acceptance. he needed love. And he didn't get it as a child. So he wanted to give it to children. I thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Pat Hall. Wow. Now confirm for me, if you will, the program says that everyone here gets a discount ticket to come visit the Beckley Rooming House.
Yes. The normal price is $40 per person. I'm giving a $10 discount.
Earlier, I had the opportunity to tell you, I don't know if you could hear it at the moment, I said, sometimes in life you have an opportunity where you're in the right place at the right time. At the 2017 conference, one of the other volunteers and I were going to go over to the Beckley Rooming House. And we called to see if we could come. And she said that she was going to be there and we could come over. And I thought it was going to be a quick in and out. And fortunately, the other volunteer was very chatty and engaged Pat in a great conversation. And when she had some things to say, I called Judith. I said, you need to come over here. And she was gracious enough to leave wherever you were, getting your hair done or something. I don't either. And anyway, she came over, and we brought Judith over. And these two women sat there and talked for an hour like they were old friends. And I'll tell you, one of the things that most touched Judith's heart during that conversation was she shared a story about her grandmother, that of all the boarders that were ever there during all the years her grandmother had that, and correct me if I'm wrong, yeah, Lee Oswald was the only boarder to have kitchen privileges. Yeah. Now that might sound like a little thing, but that was a big thing in that home, and that he was trusted and given that privilege, that said volumes. And one of the things I'm grateful for was I videotaped that whole conversation. If you go to YouTube, Judith Berry Baker visits the Oswald Rooming House, you can see that entire interview. And it's really an amazing experience of the interaction of those two women, and it's something I think will touch your heart. So if you would, one more time, Pat Hall, or the Beckley Rooming House. Thank you so much.